you. And don't forget, we still have people on our prayer list, Mary and Jim McGee, even though he's here, Barbara Dismukes, Mike Bartlett, and don't forget to pray for, we have a lot of people traveling right now, whether it's on vacations or going to graduations and things, so please keep all those people in your prayers. Do we have an announcement about the golf outing? No. Okay. Nobody wants to make an announcement about the golf outing, okay? How about volunteers? Kate, is there anything on the volunteer list that you want to announce? Anything on volunteers? No, okay. Save the 4th of July for the party at the Briggs house. And Darlene Martinez needs 3 volunteers for the very first day, which is June 20th, of Vacation Bible School. And it's just checking in and things like that. Okay, so what are the hours? What are the hours, do you know? Okay, we'll have to find out.
Mid-morning to early afternoon.
Mid-morning to early afternoon. Sometime.
I'm not sure.
Okay, is there a clipboard for the golf outing?
No, I haven't seen a clipboard. Have you? Anybody? No. Okay. Father's Day, we have Father's Day coming up, and for those of you that were here on Mother's Day, we're going to do the same thing we did for Mother's Day. We're going to ask people to give us 4 or 5 minutes about their father and the things special that they remember about him. And if you want to volunteer to do that, after listening to the ones for Mother's Day, they were so beautiful. I'm sure a lot of you are going to be inspired and want to talk about your dad. And Mike Moore is the person to contact.
Hey, I was going to suggest Monday, I thought we were on Mother's Day, turn out we had a lot of mama boys. We gotta have some daddy girls in there. We don't want to talk about their daddy. Since we're all so old, we got some great stories about the Depression and maybe the 20s and whatever.
And we're getting older every day, aren't we? Okay. Are there any announcements that anybody wants to make? Okay. Come on up here so they can hear you.
Last night we worked at John 3:16 with the Briggs. I want to tell you that it is a really fun experience. It is not labor intensive. We originally scheduled everyone to show up at 5:30, I think 5:45 or maybe even a little later. They do not come in for dinner until 6:30. And we no longer set up the tables or wipe down the tables or, we have a limited amount of labor before they eat. And then we serve. And last night there were only 6 of us between the 2 churches. And we carried it off really easily. So I encourage you to sign up with your friends and go to dinner afterwards, or sign up with a stranger in the class and meet someone new. But I will leave the sign-up sheet up here on the table, and this opens up, there's a pen, and the dates are inside. It's the first Saturday of each month, and the group with whom we work from the other church is delightful. That's my pitch. It is an assembly church. Janet, do you remember? I don't either. It's a very small church, but family works and friends. But last night everybody was shorthanded, but we pulled it on.
If you sign up, she'll be sure you know where to go.
Oh, yes, I do. Downtown. Okay,
It's one thing in this class, everybody's willing to tell you where to go. Okay, Ron, would you like to introduce our speaker, please?
Thank you, Kate. So we welcome this morning Mieke Epps as our guest teacher, and she's going to share her experience as a Dutch child during the Nazi occupation in Holland. Kay and I and Hank and Raymond were here earlier today, gathered around Mieke, trying to get her set up for the sound system. And I'm sitting there thinking, how many challengers does it take to mic Mieke? And after Mike Moore's comments about Mother's Day, the whole day got darker. Mieke was born in Holland, where she spent her early childhood years under German occupation, during which she and her family endured forced evacuation, her father's internment, and the famous Hunger Winter. Life continued to be stressful long after the war ended in May 1945 due to her father's job changes, lack of resources, frequent moves. At age 27, Mieke arrived in Tulsa in 1967 by herself with 2 suitcases, a few traveler's checks. That was before mine. What's the traveler's check? A hot water bottle for cold winters, and a Dutch library diploma. To work in the downtown library, part of an 18-month U.S. State Department Dutch Young Professional Program. Tulsa became her new home after she met and married a Tulsan. During her 14-year marriage, she earned a bachelor's in sociology and a master's in social work. Subsequently started her mental health career as a counselor in 1982. In the fall of 1987, Mieke joined a team of 45 American therapists hired under the Reagan administration to implement a substance abuse prevention pilot program for U.S. Army military installations in Western Europe. Think about that. Now an American citizen, Mieke is providing services for the U.S. military that had liberated her country in 1945, 42 years earlier. 1991, back in Tulsa, Mieke became clinical director of the Tulsa Boys Home until retirement in 2021. I'm trusting, Mieke, your early adverse childhood experiences greatly informed and empowered your assisting that population. Mieke has written a moving memoir entitled From Wallflower to Wildflower, How My Dutch Roots Became American Branches. I was going to ask Mieke's buddy David about the wildflower part, but he's not here today. Mieke's story is timely and relatable, not only because tomorrow is D-Day, but because we witness wars and violence, as Michael was saying earlier, around the world, in our country, and lately in our community. Please welcome Mieke Epps.
Kay is going to push my buttons.
I got one eye closed, but not my good eye.
Thank you, thank you. All right. All right, this is a great, lively group. Thank you so much for coming and for listening to my story. I was frankly a little ambivalent about sharing my story with you. There's so much going on in Tulsa, in the world, everywhere, so do I need to add another sad story to this? On the other hand, I think my story is an example of resiliency and recovery and what can happen if you're determined to make the best of what life presents you. My mother always said, when life brings you lemons, make it into lemonade. And I've added another piece to that. The Chinese have a symbol for crisis, and it has a twofold meaning, danger and opportunity. So I have hopefully used many opportunities in my life to overcome some of the hardships that we dealt with when I was growing up. It's very timely to have this topic right now because of the 100-day war in the Ukraine. And for me, of course, it's a special trigger for my childhood because I always look at the kids that I see on television. How are they doing right now? And what are they, well, how is this going to impact their lives? And then I think about mine, and I think it is possible, not for everybody, not everybody is the same, but it is possible to overcome difficult times that we all have had in our lives. But the impact on families, children, the country, the economy, arts and treasures in a nation when there is war is just unfathomable. It's just amazing. And tomorrow, as Ron was saying, is the 78th anniversary of D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, which was the last year of the war for us, which was what we call the Hunger Winter, and I'll cover that for you. After I retired from the Tulsa Boys Home in 2010, I dedicated the next 10 years of my life to writing my memoirs. People had said, you need to write your stories down. And I had looked at my stories from an outsider looking in, as if it wasn't really part of who I was. It was kind of like it happened, but I wasn't really into it. But once I started writing it, I was embedding myself in the story. I became part of it, and that made a huge difference. All of a sudden, I realized I was this little 4 or 5-year-old when the war ended, and this is what I experienced, and it really helped me to change my writing. I bought a copy of the book right here. And you can sign up later if you're interested in reading it. Most of it is on a PDF file on the computer, but you can, I have 2 hard copies not with me, but if you sign up, I can loan you the hard copies. So anyway. So, I also got a map of Europe. I forgot to iron it, sorry. So it's not very clear. But, you know, people ask me, well, where is Holland? And, you know, is it Scandinavia or, anyway, I'll show you. This is Europe here, and this is Holland right here. It's this tiny country that's close to 5 times smaller than Oklahoma. But Oklahoma right now has 3.5 million people, approximately. Holland has 17.5 million people. So we're 5 times smaller, so it's a very densely populated country. Most of you probably have relatives or family members who served during World War II in Europe. I see several of you nodding your heads, so you've heard many stories of them. And some of you have been there, I'm sure, to also visit. So as you can tell, Holland over here is right across from England and Great Britain. Great Britain was an ally in the war, so I'll talk about what that meant for us to be over here. I need to go back to the, here, this. So let me start the story about our family. My parents were married in June of 1939. The war broke out in Europe in September of that year. And Hitler had signed a neutrality agreement with the Netherlands. So we felt relatively safe, thinking that we would probably avoid being invaded, just like we were during World War I. We were never occupied during World War I. My father had started a private practice as an attorney on a small island in the Netherlands, and you can see it over there, it's circled there. In the southwest of Holland, he was an attorney. So after they were married, they settled in over there. And then, all of a sudden, on May 10th, 1940, it's sometimes hard for me to talk about all this, as you can tell. On May 10th of 1940, my parents woke up when their windows were rattling and shaking. And it sounded like thunder in the distance, and they couldn't figure out what it was. So they woke up, and then the airway sirens started to go off. And they knew this was bad news. So they immediately, I was three weeks old at the time, I was just born. So they decided that the best thing to do was to hide in the dark basement of our 16th century rental home, which is where we were. I have a picture of that. Oops. How do I show this? I think my needs to help that it's not moving. So, on the day, May 10th, 1940 was also the day that Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. Is Britain?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. This is my parents' wedding picture. And this is the island where we were born. The island is very small and was surrounded by the North Sea in open connection with pretty treacherous waters at times. There were moments when we couldn't even get on and off the island. This was the town. It's on the historic register. It's a very small community and it looks just as quaint as you can see in this picture. It's a beautiful little city. And at the time, the island was not connected to anything else, so the only way to get on and off the island was by ferry boat. And this is the house where I was born. My dad rented part of it, and I was born in the back room. So I was 3 weeks old when the windows started to rattle and when we were hiding in the basement of our home. The reason why my parents' windows were rattling is because the city of Rotterdam, not too far from us, just north of us, I don't have a map now. Anyway, was bombed at that time. That was the first attack of the Germans in the Netherlands. And my uncle, who lived there with his family, stood on the rooftop to see the devastation of the center of Rotterdam being destroyed. Thousands of people were killed and his business was also destroyed. The Dutch army was not prepared for an invasion. And so a few days after we were invaded, the military surrendered and we were under German occupation. Next, of course, enemy soldiers came everywhere, and all of a sudden the cobblestone streets of our little village, our little town, were filled with German soldiers in weird outfits, with weird helmets. They spoke another language, and very harsh and very dictatorial, and immediately things started to shift and change. Immediately we had to cover our windows with black shades, we were on rations, we couldn't go where we wanted to go, and our area in the country became a so-called danger zone because we were so close to England. Hitler was afraid that the Allies were going to, maybe come into Holland through our area. So they called it the danger zone, and they were monitoring the waterways, which meant that we couldn't get on and off the island but we wanted to. We were used to going everywhere we wanted to by ferry boat without asking permission. And from that moment on, we had to get permission from the German authority to get on and off the island. Another thing that happened was that somehow the Germans forgot that they needed to spend the night somewhere on the island. They forgot to bring their tents. I don't know what they had in mind. But anyway, so there was a shortage of places for them to spend the night, which meant that the citizens, like our family, were required to take the soldiers, enemy soldiers, into our homes. It's called billeting. For several weeks, and even for several months, people took the soldiers into their homes. German soldiers slept in our beds, they used our coffee, they used our facilities, our bathrooms. They left in the morning, came back at night, and that's how it was for many hours. It was pretty, and of course everything was communicated only in German. The Germans didn't know Dutch. Many of the Dutch people spoke German, but not all of them either. My father immediately kicked into gear and became a volunteer to see if he could be of assistance. And he also joined a community called the Dutch Union, which was helpful with the intent to liberate the country as soon as possible. He was very outspoken about his anti-Nazi sentiment. He was pretty well known in the community for his leadership role. And he was outspoken anti-German, like all of our family members on both sides of the family, except for one person. His only brother, my uncle, who stood on the rooftop during the bombardment in Rotterdam, also joined the Dutch resistance. and became one of the top figures in the Dutch resistance, coordinating the liberation in 45 with the Dutch government in exile in England. And he actually lost his life just a few months before the war ended, and I'll tell you more about that. Not everybody was anti-German and had anti-German sentiments. There were also enough collaborators who coordinated things with the Germans. One thing that the Nazis started doing right away, shortly after the invasion, is gathering in the names of people who were anti-Hitler. People like my dad, who were very outspoken. We didn't know that list existed, but the list started to grow and grow and grow and grew bigger as time went on. Unbeknownst to us, my father's name was on the list. And on May 4th, 1942, 2 German soldiers arrived at our home and took my father away to an unknown destination. My mom was 23 years old. I just had turned 2 years old. She was pregnant with her second child. She didn't know where he was going. Was he going to a labor camp in Germany, or where was he going to end up? And then she found out during the day, when she listened to the radio and she talked to her friends, that not only my father was taken away and captured, but so were close to 1,000 other men of prominence in the country, all over the country, were taken away that same day, lifted from their beds, and taken to an unknown destination. Of course, everybody was afraid of going to a German labor camp, or worse. And so we were on hold. After 3 days, lo and behold, my father called home. Unbelievable story, really. He had permission from the camp commander to call home and tell us where he was. And he and all the other internees were actually taken to an old Catholic seminary that the Germans had converted into an internment camp and surrounded with barbed wire. All the internees were taken over there. Let me see if I have a picture of that. This is the tower where my father volunteered as a night watchman right after the invasion. You see how beautiful that little town is with the drawbridges, and it just looks exactly like this till today. This is the place where my father was kept for 8 months with the other people. This was the old Catholic seminary that the Germans had, taken over and converted into a camp. So my dad called and told us where he was, and he said, "I'm going to send my dirty laundry home every week. And I want you to send it clean laundry back, and please send me some care packages." Well, big deal. So at least we know he was in Holland. And my mom and I started to come up with care packages right away. And my mom also decided that it was important for my father to keep track of my progress. And so she started to come up with a little diary. This is the original one. I brought it with me. It's real small and real tiny. And so every week she would she would take a picture, and she would write something about my progress on it, and then send it to my dad with his clean laundry in the same package. And then he would put it in this little diary. She also sent him the cover, and he had a little trunk, so it just fit in here. And she kept that up for I don't know how long, until the baby was born. At least she had time to do it. So that's a real treasure that I have. So Dad stayed there for 8 months. And meanwhile, my little baby brother was born on July 28th. My father was not allowed to come home. But he received a telegram. There's the good news. You have a son. And they had already decided what his name would be. Although, of course, in those days, you didn't know what you were going to get. Good thing there were more choices than just boys and girls. And my mother survived that time financially with support from the family and the support from the government. In August of that year, several months after the detainees were placed in this internment camp, 5 hostages from my father's camp were executed by the Germans. The rationale for the camp was that they wanted the prominent people of the country to be held as hostages so they could kill them when the Allies did something that was against the Germans, obviously. If the Allies were bombing Germany or the Dutch were not cooperating in the way they wanted to, they threatened to kill some of the hostages. And actually, in August of that same year of 42, that's exactly what they did. 5 hostages were killed. And among those 5 hostages, the reason I'm bringing it up, were 2 uncles of Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn, you may not know this, but she was of Dutch heritage. Her mother was Dutch, her father was British. She and her mother lived in the Netherlands during the war, and Audrey Hepburn was a teenager during that time. I brought her book because it's a great story of her life, but also of what we all endured during the war, if you ever want to read it. This is in the library. It's called The Dutch Girl. The reason why Audrey probably died at a relatively early age, according to the historians, she died, I think, in her early 60s, because she was severely nutritionally deprived during the war. She didn't get the right crop, and she developed an eating disorder as well. 2 of her uncles were part of the 5 hostages who were killed during that first coup of the Germans. There was an immediate outrage of the international community about that incident. And so much pressure was put on Hitler to release some of the detainees that he started to come up with a list of who might be the first ones to be released. And lo and behold, my dad, who was one of the first ones to be captured, was also one of the first ones to be released. So mid-December of 1942, my dad returned home. And I have this is me with a care package for my father. And here, this is my dad, home again, December 19th, 1942. I'm not too sure about my dad. I haven't seen him for a long time. As you can see, I'll put my hand on his back, but who is this guy, you know? And it was the first time he saw his son. He had never seen my brother, who by then was 4 months old. My brother wasn't sure either about what to do with his father. My dad immediately started to pick up the pieces of his legal practice, but that never really got back off the ground. He also really suffered from survivor guilt. He had a hard time realizing that he survived and his buddies were still in the camp, many of them who had become his friends. An interesting anecdote is that while my dad was in the camp, his brother, my uncle, came to visit him, which was rare to get visitors. But I'm telling you this because it's kind of an interesting story. And my dad walked into the reception area and saw his brother, but his brother was disguised. His brother, my uncle, who was in the resistance, was on the most wanted list for the Germans. He was constantly on the run to avoid being captured. But somehow he managed to come to the camp. He dressed up differently, but my father recognized him, and they kind of just shook hands as if they were acquaintances. And then my uncle told my dad, I brought you something from your mother, and I want to give it to you. So he handed him something, and then he left, my uncle left, and my father went back to his room and opened it up, and in the package was a cake, and it was very heavy. It didn't look like a regular birthday cake or any kind. It also wasn't his birthday. So he started cutting the cake open, and inside the cake was a cutting tool to cut himself through the barbed wire and escape, if possible. So that his brother had given him a tool to get out of the camp. But what his brother had failed to realize is my dad was an amputee. There's no way he could run away. He had lost his left leg in the train accident when he was 12. So even under good conditions, he could not have escaped. And even so, he wouldn't have done it, because if he had run, the Germans would have captured my family, and that would have been disastrous for us. So, but anyway, I think that's kind of an interesting anecdote, that these things like that were happening. They were not mistreated in the camp, but overall, it was a very difficult time. So all along, when my father returned, the question was, what are we going to do? How long is this going to last? Just like now in the Ukraine, how many more days are we going to have to suffer from these atrocities and all these horrible things that are going on? Lo and behold, the enemy decided what was going to come next. They had a plan. Hitler had already strengthened the coastline from Norway all the way to the south of France. He had put bunkers out there, he had strengthened it, he was prepared. He knew that there was going to be some kind of a D-Day invasion along the coast of Europe. So he wanted to strengthen that whole coastline. And in the Netherlands, what he was doing is he wanted to flood the area where we were living. We were living in the southwest of Holland. It was close to England, so to avoid the Allies from landing there, he said, we're going to remove everybody and just flood that whole region so they can't land there. So all of a sudden, in February of 1944, the rumors had started flying already, but nobody could even fathom that you would evacuate hundreds and thousands of people, with farmland there, and where would they go? Nobody on the mainland was waiting for other people to take in. It was 1944. But in February, a German proclamation to all the citizens in our area told us that we had 2 weeks to vacate everything and leave everything behind. I'm going to read you a little piece of my journal, of my memoirs about that time and what it meant to my brother and me to be evacuated. No sooner after the proclamation was over, no sooner had everybody hurried home to start packing, or the Dutch Red Cross showed up to help with the transition. They made a list of all citizens, adults and children. As a 4-year-old, I was now labeled a victim of war crimes. With so much to do, my parents decided their 2 young children were better off staying with their grandparents in the east of Holland. My father obtained the necessary travel permits for his in-laws to get on the island. Here's an account of what happened through the eyes of 2 toddlers, my 2-year-old little brother, who was still in cloth diapers, and me, I was almost 4. Here's a quote. On a bitterly cold and windy Sunday morning in February of 1944, my brother and I were wrapped in wool blankets and lifted onto a Red Cross truck into the arms of our grandparents who had arrived the day before. There were other families and children we knew on the same truck. My parents stood along the sidewalk to wave us goodbye. Mom had tears in her eyes. She was worried sick about the safety of her children traveling in a war zone. Traveling was dangerous enterprise in those days, needless to say. My father's face looked pale and somber. He had just aged a few years. This was the end of his legal practice. As a breadwinner, how was he going to provide for his family? After the truck got on the ferry boat, we took off. We were now on ocean water from the North Sea, with gunfire in the distance. Don't worry, said my grandfather. That's far away. The bad soldiers are still trying to get us, but this will soon be over. My brother and I snuggled more closely into the laps of our grandparents. When we reached the coast, the truck continued on a long and bumpy road. Roads were in terrible condition, forcing us to make several stops. We saw places that had been bombed, people pushing carts with their belongings piled high, and kids dragging behind their parents. We were cold and tired. The truck was not heated. My grandmother gave us something to drink and a piece of dry bread. Later that afternoon, we arrived in Rotterdam. A trip that would normally take less than 2 hours by car had taken us all day. We found our way to a friend's house where we spent the night. The next morning, we resumed our trip. We found this time we used public transportation. Trains and buses with poor connections and long layovers. There were Germans on the German soldiers on the train. We heard more fighting, saw more rubble, more places that were bombed along the way. Until we finally reached, on the end of the second day, we reached my grandparents' house. By then we had been traveling for 2 days. But at least we were together, now in the east of Holland, close to the German border, and my parents followed us 4 days later. With 8 suitcases and left everything else behind. We were displaced, we were homeless, and Dad was without a job. And this was wartime, what to do. So, and that's when we got a lucky break. My father, of course, started, while we were living with my grandparents, my father started to look for a job. He called around. The phones were still working in those days. We didn't have cell phones, we just had regular dial phones. You had to be careful who you were talking to because the Germans were listening in on the conversations. But what happened is that one of the people who had been in the camp with my father heard that my dad was looking for a job. This guy who had been in the camp was an attorney, who was a Dutch citizen, trying to hide from the Germans because they wanted to put him in a labor camp. Any able-bodied person from Dutch descent was captured by the Germans to work in German labor camps. So this attorney was wanting to hide from the Germans, and found out that my dad was looking to take over legal practice. So great deal. We were very lucky. So he called my dad and said, "Can you come over right away and take over my practice?" And this was in the northeast part of the country. So we were very lucky that we were able to go there. And what happened is, of course, there was such a housing shortage in those days that we were forced then to move in with a widow and live on the second floor of her home in that small town. Well, that took over the practice of this particular person. And then her second floor was furnished, so we lived in borrowed furniture and camped out on the second floor, bedroom floor of this house during the last day of the war. While my dad was continuing to take over the practice. That was not an easy situation, needless to say. The bathroom, there was no kitchen on the second floor, so my dad turned the bathroom into a kitchen by covering the bathtub with plywood and hooking up some kind of little gas stove. And we had a little potbelly stove in one of the rooms. And we were right across the street from a German casino where day and night the German soldiers were coming in and with their drunken brawls, in the middle of the night. I remember waking up, listening to their songs, and lo and behold, when I saw the film Schindler's List years later, I recognized some of those songs because they were the same songs that the soldiers were singing across the street from our house. It was a familiar sound, like, oh, I've heard those before. That last year of let's see if there is another. This is a picture of where we were living that last year of the war. You see, they're truly war pictures. They're difficult to see, but at least there were some. And this was out on the balcony, and when you looked over the balcony, you could see out on the casino across the street that I just mentioned. The last year of the war, 44-45, was called in Holland the Hunger Winter. And the Hunger Winter was called that way because there was such a shortage of resources and supplies that people were starting to really be deprived of nutritional value. And there was also a strike by the Dutch against the Germans. The Germans were hauling everything off back to Germany, everything they could find, whatever supplies they were, food or other supplies that were bringing them back to Germany. And so the Dutch government in London told the Dutch citizens to go on strike and prevent the railroad system from assisting the Germans in that effort. So all the trains were halted, no more transports, no more supplies going anywhere. But it also meant that the Dutch citizens were deprived of their supplies. They couldn't get any food, so the hunger, it was a terrible situation. And stories started to come our way. We were living in the northwest of Holland, northeast of Holland, close to the German border. But people in the west coast were really suffering from the deprivation. And we were hearing stories about people just, leaving and wandering across the country in search of food. And lo and behold, a few days after we had heard those stories, they started knocking on our doors. Strangers, people we hadn't met. You didn't know if they were good or bad people, or if they were pro-Hitler or anti-Hitler. These were people who were hungry and tired. They were wandering around the country, and they were knocking on our doors. So we took strangers in. We were on rations. We didn't have any food either, but we shared whatever it was. And that last Christmas of the war, 1944-45, we had two nurses who had walked across the country, and they spent Christmas with us. My mother had found a little green branch in the street somewhere from a tree. I don't know how that happened. We put and I held her tiny little red ribbon around it. That was our Christmas tree. And the nurses, we said that I remember that because I was 4 and a half and I have some memories of that. We were all sitting around a little branch. My father was reading the Christmas story, and we were singing carols and praying for peace on earth. Peace on earth. That was what we were praying for. We were desperate. By then, of course, for the winter of 44-45, D-Day already had taken place. That happened shortly after we had moved to the area. All of a sudden we heard the Allies had landed in Normandy. D-Day is here, and we should be liberated in 44. Everybody in Holland thought we were going to be liberated in 1944 after D-Day. This seemed like the right thing to happen. We were ready for it, needless to say. But it took another year, and the worst was yet to come. That hunger winter was the worst. After a while, we didn't have any electricity, no water, no electricity. There was so much bombing going on in our area that our windows were boarded up. And because we could no longer cook at home, my mother and I made daily trips to the soup kitchen through snow and ice. First on her bike, then her bike was stolen. And then we had to walk, and I was wearing shoes and mittens, but I was so cold, I was miserable, but I was allowed to carry the little food bucket. It was about this tall, this little bucket, metal bucket, not insulated. And I carried it when I was sitting on my mom's bike, and later on we just walked together. And so we would go to the food line, and then somebody would fill it up with this awful mixture of, what looked like slime to me, slivering potatoes in water with some green in it as well. And then we had to walk home to bring it to our family. And you would think we would devour it because we didn't have anything to eat except for dried bread, and who knows what else we had to eat. But I was so tired and so upset by the time I got back. I didn't want to eat any of that anyway. It was also cold by then, of course. This is just a miserable time. And it lasted for several months. And because our windows were boarded up, we had to go to bed early because it's dark inside. And we went to bed when our last candle rations for the day were gone. We were having light by candlelight. And then increasingly, because of the fact that we were in this war zone and this fighting area, we were hiding in the basement. From January 1st to April of 1945, 91 air raid sirens in our area caused us to have to just hide constantly in the basement, day or night, for fear that we might be bombed again. And twice, the bombs were dropping within 200 meters of our home, which is what caused the windows to be destroyed. So it was just a very, very difficult time. And then one day my mother said to me, "Why don't you come over and touch my belly?" And I thought, I was about 4 or so when it happened. She said, "Why don't you see if you feel anything?" So I felt it. I felt something moving when I put my hand on her stomach. She said, "We're going to have a little brother or sister in April of 1945. I thought, holy moly. I didn't know what to think of it, but I said, I'll help out. My mom said, okay, I'll make you a little nursing house there. You can help us. So she was pregnant, not planned. But actually, of course, she didn't have any nutritional value, no prenatal care, nothing. And as things got worse, you know, we were going to bed dressed in our street clothes because we were getting up so many times during the night. We might as well, except for our shoes, we just went under the covers. And so anyway, but then finally, on April 13th of 1945, we were liberated. The reason why that delay took place is that there was and why we were not liberated in 1944 was a result of the disastrous outcome of Operation Market Garden, documented in the film The Bridge Too Far. I'm sure many of you have heard about it, see some of you nodding your head. Operation Market Garden was a poorly planned military strategic intervention to try to, you know, finally get rid of the Germans in Holland. That didn't work. The Germans won that battle, which delayed the liberation of our country for several months and caused us to endure that horrible last time of winter. But finally, on April 13th of 1945, my father woke us up in the morning, my brother and I in the morning. My mother was about to deliver, but she hadn't yet. He said, we're going to be liberated. I want you to come with me and stand on the side of the road. We're going to look and see who these soldiers are, whose soldiers that are coming in to liberate us. I didn't know what liberation meant. You know, it sounded like a big word. Who knew it? But I thought, well, it was something in my dad's voice that made me think, well, this is kind of special, I guess, you know, something like that. So there we were, standing along the road, holding hands with my father. And he had just lost his brother 2 or 3 months before that. His brother was executed by the Germans for his role during the resistance. And there came the Canadians driving in on their grain carriers and their motorcycles. The noise was deaf. I mean, it was immense. I can still remember. People started to dance in the streets, and the women were climbing the tanks. And all of a sudden, the Dutch flags were flying everywhere. And I didn't even know the Dutch flag. We were not allowed to have a Dutch flag. The Dutch flag was forbidden. All I had seen was the German flag, was the swastika. But they were gone, the German soldiers were all gone too. But here, the Dutch flags, and some were original flags that people had hidden in their homes somewhere. But other flags were just made from scraps. And so all the flags were flying, and people were laughing and dancing, and I mean, it was just a joyful party, something that I had never seen before. And my mother, right before she delivered my little sister, made little freedom outfits for my brother and myself. This is a picture that I found in my sister's baby book about my brother and I walking along right after we were liberated, holding these little orange flags that we had both made, and wearing the outfits my mother had made from scratch that she found or had borrowed or were given to her, little sashes and all that stuff. And my brother and I basically spent the next few days walking around the town, things we had never done. We didn't know what freedom was. We weren't allowed to play outside. It was too scary, you know, you just didn't do that. But now we were allowed to walk around outside, not only play outside, but also walk around under the supervision of an older person who was with us. That was an incredible experience, and then a few days later, on April 18th, my little sister was born. And she was the most beautiful baby of the three of us, despite the fact of lack of nutrition. She was just a beautiful child. I know that we're getting close. I wanted to end with another story that coincided with this. And because during the war, not only were we worried about our own well-being and the loved ones who lived in the Netherlands, but there was another piece to the puzzle. The Netherlands had colonies all over the world, and one of the colonies was Indonesia. And Indonesia was still a colony at that time. Half of our relatives on my dad's side and on my mother's side were living in Indonesia during the time when Japan invaded Indonesia in 1942 after Pearl Harbor. So immediately, all our Dutch relatives in Indonesia were placed in Japanese internment camps and spent the next 3.5 years in those camps. And fortunately, most of them survived. But needless to say, that was a very scary situation for our family because we didn't know where they were and what was happening to them. I want to end with these pictures of the liberation. This is what I saw as a child standing in the streets. These were the Canadians rolling in their tanks, and women with their flags, the Dutch flag. And this is a picture of me at 5 years old being a liberated woman at 5 years old. Our relatives from Indonesia returned in 1946. These are German dishes that we found in our home after the war, and the Germans had left. It's a swastika on the back. These are pictures of my dad's brother, my mom's brother, and an uncle who were all killed as a result of World War II. I just don't have time to go into all those details, but I wanted to show you some of the loved ones that we lost, and that was just the beginning. First picture of our family, taken 6 months after the war, and it gives you an idea of that, my dad in the three-piece suit. He ended up becoming a part of the War Crimes Tribunal in the Netherlands. He was asked to serve on the War Crimes Tribunal for 2 years, and then ended up becoming a federal judge for the rest of his life. And this will be the end. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story. We all have stories, and I hope you will share yours. And this may have to be the end of this presentation. Is there time for question and answer or not? Yeah, just a little bit? Okay. I know I've rushed through it, there's just so many details. And can I share a little bit of how the war impacted my life? And, yeah? 2 minutes. Okay. All right. After the war, there were no welcome wagons with warm soup waiting for us, no teddy bears or blankets for the children. Everywhere you looked were ruins, boarded up windows, deserted homes, broken trees, broken spirits. Yet those who survived were determined to move on, and the children were told, be glad the war is over. You were too young to remember. Or we were told that we didn't have it as bad as others. We better be grateful. Yet I had spent countless hours in cold, dark basements, hiding from warplanes flying over, listening to bombs being dropped close to our home. I heard gunshots in the streets and remembered what it was like to be hungry for days. I also remembered the fearful looks of my mom when Dad was late to return home because he couldn't call. I felt miserable inside, but there was no one to talk to. The adults were too preoccupied, and in those days, no one understood the impact of trauma, certainly no childhood trauma. Over time, my behavior was typical for the troubled child. I was in a fight-or-flight mode, hiding out or striking out in anger. I could not relate to my mother, who suffered from mild depression. My father was gone a lot and became only the disciplinarian. My parents cracked down on me. They didn't understand my behavior, what it was related to. They gave me labels, self-centered, egotistical, recalcitrant, rebellious, etc. And then they added the French label, enfant terrible, terrible child. Needless to say, my self-esteem took a nosedive, and I was really miserable and lonely. And in 1955, I repressed all of it until 1955, when the Murrah building in Oklahoma City was bombed. And that triggered for me everything that I had experienced. That opened me up and started me to talk finally about my childhood, and eventually to write my stories. And then my parents gave us a journal they had kept during the war because they didn't even know about it, so I found out about that as well. So it took that long to finally come to grips with all that. And now I need to stop here, right? Okay.